I'd like to thank our sponsors, Blood Moon Box, a monthly subscription box service for period pads and tampons to help support all humans who have a cycle for that time of the month, and no need to run to a store to mix and match period supplies that don't cater to the entire ebbs and flows of your cycle. There are 2-box options based on your cycle, light and medium, and then heavy. And in addition to the period products, you'll also receive PMS herbal teas, a candle, and some other items for your time of the month. You can reserve a box by navigating to bloodmoonbox.com. And bloodmoonbox.com is on a mission to destigmatize the idea of period blood. At Blood Moon Box, they believe that it is the time to honor the enchanting magic within every person who has a cycle. So join us in embracing the magic of your cycle with Blood Moon Box. Hi, my name is Yasmin Terehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, spirituality, and consciousness. Today's episode is with Rick Doblin, the founder and president of Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, known as MAPS. He received his doctorate in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he wrote his dissertation on the regulation of the medical uses of psychedelics and marijuana, and his master's thesis on a survey of oncologists about smoked marijuana versus the oral THC pill in nausea control for cancer patients. He's got such an incredible breadth of experience in the psychedelic and plant medicine space. He founded MAPS in 1986, and he has an amazing TED Talk, which you should find out about, called The Future of Psychedelic Assisted Therapy. And I am so excited to welcome Rick to the show. We initially met at a conference a couple months ago and had a lovely conversation, and I've just been following his work for a long time. So welcome to the show, Rick.
Thank you, Yasmin. I've been looking forward to our discussion for quite a while.
Likewise. So, Rick, to kick it off, why do you think psychedelics and plant medicine are so important? And maybe, for our audience that's so diverse, maybe you could also define what these terms mean, like what the difference between psychedelics and plant medicine are.
I'd be glad to start there. So, the word psychedelic did not exist until a dialogue in the 50s between Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond. And they were realizing that the words that had been used before for this class of drugs didn't quite capture what was going on. So one of the words was psychotomimetic, which means mimics psychosis. That was what people thought initially when they observed the LSD experience. And actually Sandoz, where Albert Hofmann was when he really discovered the psychedelic properties of LSD in 1943, they suggested that it could be good for psychiatrists to take in order to understand more about what their mentally ill patients were going through. And so they called it psychotomimetic. But over time, they realized that there was more going on. This wasn't really psychosis. It was something much, much different. The other word, hallucinogen, had been used, which is very negative in the sense that it's a hallucination, it's a delusion, it's not real, there's nothing really of value there, it's not solid. And so there was this growing sense that a new word was needed. And so in poetry, back and forth between Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond, they were trying out new different words. And so Humphrey Osmond wrote a book to sink to hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And so psychedelic was a word that Humphrey Osmond made up. And it's psyche, the mind. Delos is to reveal. So it's mind manifesting, to manifest the mind. And I like to use that in the original way it was developed to also relate to dreams, to meditation, to fasting, so that psychedelic is about bringing things to the surface of our awareness. And it's not necessarily limited to drugs. So Stan Grof, the world's leading LSD researcher and theoretician, the co-founder of transpersonal psychology, developed what he called holotropic breath work, And this was after LSD was criminalized and research was shut down. And so you can produce experiences that are very similar in many respects to LSD just from hyperventilation. So psychedelic meaning mind manifesting. Plant medicines is a kind of a way to appeal to people's sense that things that are in nature are somehow or other good and healthy. And if things come from the laboratory, we're somewhat more suspicious of that. Um, Not justifiably so. There's a lot of plants that are poisonous, and there's a lot of synthetics that are, tremendously valuable, like LSD, for example, or MDMA. So I think plant medicines has been the term that's been used in the United States for drug policy reform efforts, for initiatives on state levels to create legal contexts for people to experience psychedelic states of consciousness, regardless of whether they actually have a diagnosis. So the work that MAPS is doing with MDMA, the work that other groups are doing with psilocybin, is mostly to work through the FDA to develop them into prescription medicines that would be covered by insurance. And that's very, very important, but that takes a long time. And so there's been these efforts. Colorado was the first, in Denver, they made mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority. That spread to a lot of different cities around the country. Oregon made the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative, which created a state training program and state legal access for people with diagnoses or looking for personal growth. Colorado passed natural plant medicines, and now it's going to be on the ballot in Massachusetts in November, another natural plant medicines. And they find that when people add MDMA or LSD to it, then it doesn't pass because they think, oh, it's not just plants, now it's synthetics, and people are more cautious about that. There has been another word that has been developed, entheogen, which is defined as revealing the God within, like theos or theology. I don't particularly like that word or use it. And I think when we think about the messages that words convey, hallucinogen conveys this idea that, as I said before, that it's a delusion and it's not really valuable. It's a pejorative negative word. Entheogen, I think, is propaganda on the other side. It's not always spiritual when people take psychedelics. It can often be really disorienting for people unless there's a lot of therapeutic support. So it's not always revealing the God within. So I prefer the word psychedelic, which I think is more neutral and applies to a broad range of catalysts other than just physical substances.
Yeah. So I want to dive into this, the conversation around when people think about psychedelics, especially folks who are maybe new to the space, there's always this kind of reply that, oh, it's just something happening in the brain locally. And so I'm curious because I think this spiritual lens on psychedelics is so interesting. What is your perspective on this debate between is this something that's local versus non-local? And what's your perspective on the sort of spirituality connection to the world of psychedelics? Do you believe that or not? And why?
Well, let's look now broadly at humanity over the last several thousands of years. The world's longest running mystery ceremony involving a psychedelic was the Eleusinian Mysteries, and it was the Greeks, and it was from around 1600 BC to almost 400 AD when it was wiped out by the Catholic Church in a power play. So psychedelics are part of the foundations of democracy in the Greeks, the foundations of philosophy. And they often had a very spiritual aspect. And the idea of the Eleusinian Mysteries was about the mystery of life and death and this eternal process that we're involved in of life and death. Psychedelics have been used for thousands of years in other cultural contexts. Ayahuasca in South America, ibogaine in Africa. There's been soma in in India. So there's always been these physical substances that have been associated with um, spiritual experiences. And often these spiritual experiences in these cultural contexts were also combined with healing. It was about both, spirituality and medicine. And I do think that there's a reason this has been going on for thousands of years, a reason that they survived despite the fact that dominator organizations, like various organized religions, have tried to squash it. And they're about direct spirituality. So I think that's why they threaten certain organizations that they enable people to have this direct experience of going beyond their what people used to call the skin encapsulated ego, where we are really focused on what we need for survival, for thriving, but often we don't have this perspective of how we're part of something much larger. From a scientific point of view, the very first study that was done to really examine whether psychedelics would have a spiritual aspect to it and could produce this mystical unit of experience took place in 1962. This was one of the best things that Timothy Leary did at Harvard. Walter Pahnke was his PhD student, was a doctor and a minister, and they conducted what is called the Good Friday experiment. And it took people, 20 divinity students from Andover Newton Theological Seminary, and it took place inside the Boston University Chapel on Good Friday. So it was religiously inclined people in a religious setting receiving they all got a pill, half got psilocybin, half got a placebo. And the purpose was to see if they would have a spiritual experience, according to a mystical experience questionnaire that Walter Pahnke, who did the experiment, spent a year developing. And it's that same questionnaire, in essence, that is used in the current research with psychedelics after all these years, called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. And what the study demonstrated is that roughly 9 out of the 20 people had what they would consider to be a mystical experience, and 8 out of those 9 had the psilocybin, and 1 had the placebo. And I did a 25-year follow-up to that study, and did that in the middle 80s at a time of the escalation of the drug war, Nancy Reagan just say no. And if there was any time for people to feel social pressure to discount the prior validity of a psychedelic experience, it would have been when I was doing this follow-up. And they indeed affirmed the fact that it felt genuinely mystical to them at the time. And these people over time, many of them had non-drug mystical experiences to compare to that psilocybin-induced mystical experience, and they considered it to be valid and to have had a really positive contribution in their lives and deepening their spiritual understandings. So I think that for me, there's pretty much no question, based on my own experiences too, where my psychedelic experiences have moved me to really think about who I am. And many of us think about who we are as based on our gender or our nationality or our religion or our race or our tribal identification in all these different ways. And I think the transformation that we all need to go through, both as individuals and humanity as a whole, to realize that there's something deeper, which is we are part of life on Earth. We are part of this web of life on Earth, and that we're not separate from that, and that people that are different from us are actually way more similar than they are different. And I think it parallels a lot of the views that the astronauts had as they were going to the moon or going up in space. And you look back at the Earth in space and you see this as one system. You don't see the borders. You don't see the religions. There's thousands of religions in America, but they're all sort of trying to speak about similar kinds of things in different culturally context ways. But I think this idea that psychedelics produce a genuine spiritual experience, I think, has been confirmed by both thousands of years of history and also decades of scientific research as well.
I want to actually talk about some of the most popular psychedelics and what type of impact each of them have made. And also, I'm sure that there's a lot of studies on the science behind psychedelics and what it does to your own brain, right? In terms of
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
creating a positive impact. So I'd love for you to share some psychedelics that have made, really positive impact all around in the world, even of, neuroscience. I'm sure that we can talk about this for hours, but maybe we could just give a couple examples.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's start with MDMA, since now of all the psychedelics, back when I started MAPS in '86, I did kind of a strategic analysis: which psychedelic is likely to make it through the FDA system first, and then how do we pair that with a patient population? And that ended up to be MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. And it is the case now that December 11th, 2023, we submitted the data to the FDA to start the new drug application, or the NDA process, which we hope potentially will lead to FDA approval for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD sometime August or September of 2024, if all goes well. So, what we know about how MDMA actually works, there's PTSD changes your brain, and that if you have PTSD, you have hyperactive amygdala, which is where we process fear. You're always seeing the world as a dangerous place. There's a reduction in activity in the prefrontal cortex, where we think logically. So people are often triggered into feeling they're back in the traumatic situation. They can't really separate out car backfires or noises that sound like explosions, or people wearing clothes similar to what a perpetrator wore when people were sexually abused or something like that. And then there's also reduction in activity and connectivity in the hippocampus, where memories are put into long-term storage, and the connection between the amygdala and the hippocampus is reduced. So MDMA now does the opposite. MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala so that fear-based memories are not so fearful, that there's increased activity in the prefrontal cortex so people can think more logically. And then there's increased activity connectivity with the hippocampus and the amygdala so that people can take these traumatic memories that have seemed like they're never really in the past. They're always about to happen, and they're able to put them into the past. And then the other big thing about MDMA, what we know is that it releases oxytocin, which is this hormone of love, connection, nurturing mothers. And it promotes this sense of self-compassion, self-love, self-acceptance. And that's a core part of it. Now, the classic psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, um, mescaline from peyote or San Pedro, they act in a different way. They don't really reduce activity in the amygdala, um, but they reduce activity in what has been called the default mode network, which is somewhat similar to our sense of self. So that our ego identification of who we are, meaning our biological from birth to death, what is our personality, that part of the brain system is reduced. We don't filter information in that way, according to what our core needs are. And at the same time, we get connected to more information flow that's coming in. And also, often people have the sense with this ego reduction that they're part of something larger than themselves. And I think that's a big part of what it is, this idea of a spiritual experience. So I think that we have now, through science, have come to a better understanding of what people have been doing for thousands of years. And I think it does point to this idea that these experiences would be considered genuinely spiritual in many religious contexts all over the world. And we do have religions that are focused on psychedelics, like the Native American Church, where peyote is a core part of their religion, ayahuasca churches from South America, the Bwiti who use ibogaine. So I think it's kind of an unusual situation where ancient wisdom and modern science are both pointing in the same direction.
Yeah. Wow. So, okay, so let's say for folks who are listening who want to experience this for the first time or have like a very specific issue, like where should they start? Like what's kind of the first place that someone should go to if they want to explore, maybe heal some trauma? Should we go straight to the therapist, the nonprofit organizations? Like what, as I think that question has come up a lot with the audience, which is like, I don't know where to begin. I don't know what I need. So guide me.
Well, the most important thing to say in response to your question is that it's not the drug that really matters the most. It's the safe context. It's the safe supportive context. And so when people think about they want to have this experience, I think they really need to think more about the context than about the substance. And then also people need to have this other layer, which is what do they think about legal contexts versus illegal contexts? Because there has been an effort, as I started to say, through the Catholic Church around or a little bit or like 396 or so, to wipe out psychedelics and drive them underground. The burning of the witches that took place is often in the Middle Ages, they were often connected to plant medicines. Conquistadors, the first thing that they did was to kill the shamans when they came to the Western world. So I think for people that are interested in these experiences, the part that's legal right now is a part of ketamine called S-ketamine that is available for the treatment of depression. So that's something for people to think about. And there are clinics, hundreds of clinics in America. But I think this is an example of how the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma, thinks, in that S-ketamine was approved without therapy. And it doesn't work as well as it does if it were connected to therapy. But the pharma companies don't make money from therapists. And also, when you provide it without therapy, the results fade quicker and you need more S-ketamine called Spravato. So people should, if they're thinking about ketamine, they should, I would suggest, only go to places that have combined ketamine with therapy. There are places now in Oregon, people can go for psilocybin. In Colorado, it will soon be set up for plant medicines. People can go to Jamaica, to Costa Rica, to the Netherlands for legal psilocybin experiences. But the context is the critical thing. And in all the research that's been done with psychotherapy, of different kind of psychotherapies, the most important factor as far as whether people show progress is called the therapeutic alliance, meaning the trust and the sense of safety and support that exists between the therapist and the patient, and that's more important than the specific kind of therapy that's done. Is it Freudian psychoanalysis? Is it cognitive behavioral therapy, or any number of psychodynamic therapies, different kinds? It's really about this therapeutic relationship is the key thing. So it's most important for people to find a context where they really have good feelings and trust with the providers. So I think that's number one. That's more important than which drug it is and what kind of approach the providers use. I think the challenge is that it's very, very slow to go through the FDA. MAPS started in 1986, and we're hoping finally, after almost 38 years, that by the end of 2024, when it'll be 38 and a half years, hopefully we'll be ready to go to market. So there's not very many legal contexts from a federal point of view. Now, we all know about how in America there's quite a lot of marijuana legalization states, about 39 or so medical marijuana states, and that's going even though it's federally illegal, but there's no federal enforcement. So I think a good place for people to start is this holotropic breathwork, which is completely legal, and it's just based on hyperventilation. And so you could just do Google search for holotropic breathwork and find practitioners over most of the United States and Europe and other parts of the world as well. I think the challenges for people that are really suffering from PTSD, depression, and who have not found sufficient relief with the currently available therapies and medications, what do they do? Psilocybin is going to probably become a medicine in the U.S. I would guess maybe in 2027 or something like that. It's definitely going to be years behind MDMA. So it's a challenge for people. And I do just want to add that I think the drug war is fundamentally counterproductive, promotes violence, impure drugs. It doesn't really help people with drug abuse problems. It drives them away from treatment. So I do think of prohibition as fundamentally counterproductive and undue infringement on personal liberty for freedom of thought. But that's not a widespread view. But there is increasing disenchantment about the drug war. So I think people have a difficult choice about how to go forward if they feel that these substances would be useful for them. It's not so useful to say to people, wait a couple years, particularly if they're suffering now. But at the same time, it's hard to figure out what really to say. And, so I would suggest probably think about ketamine, ketamine, Spravato, but only go to clinics where they provide it with therapy.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful point, this like the therapy piece, the integration piece, because I think that has been largely left out of kind of like the mainstream conversation around psychedelics, which is, you got to do the work of integration, right? And work with someone who understands how to hold that kind of container and space, as opposed to just like experimentation without the context and the safety. So I really appreciate that. Rick, I want to talk about MAPS. You mentioned that this has been a long game for you. So I'm curious, what was your first experience, and was that kind of the catalyst that encouraged you to build MAPS and to also devote so much of your life to this work? I mean, what was the inspiration for this? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for asking that question, Yasmin. So for me, growing up in the 60s, I was born in 53, so I was kind of a young teenager in the 60s. My parents did not drink alcohol. They did not smoke cigarettes. They did not do anything to alter their consciousness. They didn't meditate, anything like that. I'm the oldest of 4 kids. And so I grew up believing the propaganda that LSD made you. We were told that if you take LSD 5 or 6 times, you're certifiably insane. I was also told that LSD will hurt your chromosomes and you'll have deformed babies. And I was told that you take LSD, you're going to jump out of a window, or you're going to stare at the sun and go blind. So I believed all these things as I was growing up. And the catalyst for me was actually literature. I loved to read. I was very shy, could hardly talk to a girl. I was just very much into books, and also very political and aware of how cruel people have been to other people, and how something needed to be figured out so that we don't murder each other or blow the planet up with a nuclear war. And so I was studying Russian to learn about the other. Actually, my parents sent me to Russia in 1970 at the height of the Cold War with a bunch of 60 other U.S. high school students trying to learn Russian, which really was incredible for me to realize that these people did not want to kill us. It was their governments, and our governments were at odds, but the people really didn't want to kill us. But in my Russian class, somebody gave me a book to read, and I loved it, and I had it back to him, and he said, "Do you realize the person wrote part of this book on LSD?" And I'm like, well, that's impossible. And well, it turned out it was true. It was Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So reading that is what really was the catalyst. I think if somebody can produce this incredibly powerful, evocative book while they're while part of it written under the influence of LSD, then I must have been told something wrong about LSD. Then my first time that I took LSD, it really did help me to decide that this was something much more substantial and serious and potentially beneficial than I had realized, although very, very difficult in that letting go of this ego sense of identification, it's not easy. And often people confuse that with physical death. This ego dissolution is often confused with physical death. And people often do think that they're dying while they're sort of letting go their sense of identity. So it was difficult for me to handle, but I had intimations that it was very important. And I also felt tremendously disappointed by my bar mitzvah when I was 13. It failed to turn me into a man. I thought I'd have some kind of spiritual connection. It didn't happen. It was a good party, but that was it. And when I took LSD, I was like, this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. Who am I? Where do I fit in? What's the larger world? What is this thing about death? Am I going to die? How does this square with how do I try to live my life in a beautiful way? But I had difficult times letting go. And I had a sequence of difficult experiences. And I went to the guidance counselor at school. And I was so unbelievably lucky that this guidance counselor took me seriously. And he gave me a book to read. And that was Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research by Stan Grof. So it was that was really the catalyst, because I saw several different things. I saw how the research had been very promising, how it had been very helpful therapeutically, how it had also produced in Stan what he called the cartography of the unconscious, a range of experiences that included this mystical sense of unitive consciousness and connection that had, I thought, and Stan talked about it in this way, certain political implications. If you feel you're part of everything and everything's part of you, it's harder for you to demonize others and to kill them and to make them the problem, because we realize we're really all in it together. And so that was the catalyst, was reading Stan's book. And luckily for me, the guidance counselor had it directly from Stan, a manuscript copy, years before it came out. And I wrote to Stan. And now I'm an 18-year-old kid, confused by my LSD experiences. He was 44 and was leading the research LSD Ph.D. at Hopkins, but his research was just being shut down. And he wrote me back and encouraged me to take a seminar with him that summer, which I did. And so I think it was this combination of a therapeutic potential and also this scientific overlay of understanding the realms of the human unconscious, validating this sort of mystical experience, and also this theory of change related to how, if we all think how we're all really connected, that might have really important implications for how we treat the planet, how we treat nature, and how we treat each other. And because I was learning about this as it was wiped out, as the research had been wiped out, as the backlash had taken over, I thought, well, I have some privileges. My family is very supportive. And so this will be a good way to contribute to a better world, to try to bring back psychedelic research. So that was 1972, more than 50 years ago. And I'm so lucky that my 18-year-old self had such a good idea.
Oh my gosh, that's so amazing. I'm just also so in awe of this long game that you've played.
Yeah.
I mean, most people I think would have given up, very soon after. So
yeah, I would say, speaking of the long game, for the longest time, it has been how to bring back psychedelics. And now that there's just a psychedelic renaissance and an enormous amount of new research, way more, multiple times more than in the 60s. And so we needed a new vision to animate what we're doing. It's not make MDMA into a medicine or bring back psychedelic research. So talking about a long game, the new vision is a world of net zero trauma by 2070. And I don't think I'll be alive to see that. But I think this idea that humanity as a whole has increasing number of stresses. And I think it's going to get worse over the next couple decades. There's an estimate of 1 billion climate refugees by 2050 if we don't change the trajectory of climate change. So I think that the idea of net zero trauma doesn't mean no trauma. There's always going to be trauma. There's always going to be death and illness and sadness and accidents. But net zero just means that we're not adding to the global burden of trauma, because we also know about multi-generational trauma. Trauma can be passed on genetically through the mother or the father, in what are called epigenetic mechanisms. It's not the genes themselves, but what turns them on and off can be impacted by trauma. And so I think 2070 is, more or less, almost 50, a little bit less than 50 years from now. But I think by that point, we could have globalized access to psychedelic assisted therapy of all different kinds, both meth and religious use, and also drug policy reform. And we can have trained enough therapists. So hopefully we will help humanity as a whole process trauma and have these deeper spiritual intimations so that we can really approach the challenge of making a heaven on earth in a more realistic way, and without a lot of this denial and frustration and demonizing others. I'll just add that Carl Jung had a beautiful quote. He said, the most important spiritual, therapeutic, and political work that we can do is withdraw the projection of our shadow onto others. And so the shadow is the parts of ourselves that we disown, and we tend to say, oh, okay, Trump is a great example of this. He's always accusing people of doing exactly what he's doing as a way to try to make it seem less outrageous what he's doing. So I think this idea of withdrawing the projection of our shadow and helping us process our emotions is critical to survival. And I think that the long game, for those of people out there who are parents, I have 3 kids. They're now in their 20s. And my wife and I were raising them. You somehow think it's going to take, they're going to be with you forever. And once they go off to college or leave home to start their own lives, you blink your eye and you look back and it's like, where did 20 years go? So that's helped me with the long-term planning. 20 years is not actually that far. And a 50-year plan is not actually that long when you look at it in the bigger context of evolution of humanity.
I love that. It's interesting, this 2070, perspective. I love that. I love hearing that that's even possible. And I think people are waking up to this work, right? The Zoomer generation is so different now, they're, it seems like extremely conscious and very self-aware and paying attention to all the kind of nuances that maybe the boomers didn't have the privilege to pay attention to. So really big congrats on staying the long game. And I want to hear your thoughts on this concept of personalized psychedelic therapy. I was listening to a former podcast that you were on, and you spoke about this being kind of something that is like a big theme that's been emerging.
Yeah, very much so. So to say it this way, really we're about psychedelic medicine. And the way in which we have to bring that about is by studying one drug at a time. So MDMA is focused on MAPS is focused on MDMA for PTSD. Other groups are focused on psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, major depressive disorders. S-ketamine was approved for depression. Ibogaine, one of its uses is going to be for helping people go through opiate withdrawals. But all of this is leading towards the place where we hope that all these different psychedelic medicines are available. They've all made it through FDA regulatory systems, and the therapists want to be cross-trained. So even though right now there's all these clinics with ketamine, a lot of them are run by people that want to also incorporate MDMA once it becomes available into those clinics. And then they'll incorporate psilocybin, and then 5-MeO DMT, and then Ibogaine. So where we really want to go, and this may be difficult for people to realize, in the sense that normal pharmaceutical companies, don't want you to use products that their competing companies are offering. But that's not what we're about. We're about what's best for the patient, what's best for society, what's best for the therapist. And so that's going to lead toward this personalized medicine where psychedelic therapists themselves will be cross-trained in the different modalities, and they will customize a treatment program for each individual patient that they work with. And it could have different sequences of drugs, even though, again, our MDMA therapy is tremendously effective in terms of our statistical analysis of our phase 3 studies. We can't say it's safe and effective until the FDA says it's an approved medicine, but we can say that we do have some very remarkable results, but that over time in the future, I think people might get a couple MDMA experiences. Then they might benefit from an experience with psilocybin or a classic psychedelic. And then maybe they end up with another MDMA experience to help them integrate it all. Or it could be fundamentally different. But that's where we're really heading. It's even though each of our companies is focused on one particular thing to try to take it through the regulatory system, it's really about bringing forth psychedelic medicine that will be personalized between patient and therapist.
Mm. I love that. That makes so much sense, right? Because I think we're all dealing with so many different, internal nuances, and also as we're changing, right? Coming out of the pandemic, for example, like people are sort of accumulating new traumas, right? Or combining traumas, and so I love that that's emerging. So I want to switch gears and talk about something a little bit sensitive, given the political climate that we're in. But I want to talk about this experiment in 2021 on the use of, I believe it was ayahuasca. So correct me if I'm wrong. It might have been MDMA, but I believe it was ayahuasca, and between Jews and Arabs, and
Yes.
what that outcome was like.
Thank you for asking. I think that's especially important now during this conflict that's so horrendous on all sides. Um, it turned out that in Israel, there were Israeli Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, and Israelis from all different religious, from secular to ultra Orthodox, that were participating in ayahuasca and MDMA experiences in these mixed spaces. So again, these are the more progressive on both sides. They're willing to be in these spaces. You're particularly vulnerable when you're taking psychedelics because you're not so much focused on the outside, you're more focused on the inside. And researchers that we work with in Israel, particularly Lior Roseman, who was at Imperial College, who's an Israeli neuroscientist, but working in Imperial and now at Exeter, took a very strong interest in noticing what was going on and thinking, is this productive? Is this use of psychedelics in these mixed spaces actually helpful for people to build bridges, whereas previously they had been more fearful about people that were different from them? And so there was a 3-year project funded by Christian Angermeyer. And it was, the first year was just interviews of everybody that was doing this. Why were they doing it? What was it like? The second year was developing a protocol. And then the third year, where Lior took a group of Israelis and Palestinians to Spain for a group ayahuasca experience. And now MAPS is working to develop another protocol for Israelis and Palestinians with MDMA. And this is not just Israel, it's for all different kind of groups that can be in conflict. MDMA can also be helpful for couples therapy, which we need to explore scientifically, but it's sort of writ large in cultures. And so there have been a couple papers that Lior published on it, but I'll just share one story, which was about an Israeli under the influence of ayahuasca, and they're doing this in a group setting, and music is a big part of this. And the person running the ceremony started playing Arabic music. And this Israeli said that his first instinct was to recoil. This is fearful. This is the music of the other. This is something that he'd always felt nervous about when he would hear it. But he said, under the influence of ayahuasca, he could let go and he could listen to it. And then he saw the beauty in it. And then he realized that we're not just, Jews and Arabs here, that we're all humans and we're trying to find these common grounds in the midst of these different kinds of conflicts. And yet it was the core sense that this music that had previously frightened him, he could see the beauty in it. And then he could see the common humanity of the people that were on the, quote, other culture or other side. So that's a tiny experiment with a few people, but one is looking in a great desperation for what can we do to respond to all the pain and suffering and all the trauma. And I think it's this sense of really coming together and celebrating our common humanity and appreciating differences, not being scared by them, but appreciating them and trying to learn for why did people come up with a different cultural context? What did they think? So I think it's a very small effort, but psychedelics for conflict resolution, for understanding common humanity, I think it's going to be growing as an area of research, very much so in the future.
I love that so much. And this is also for those who are listening who might be in a conflict zone or have access to folks in the conflict zones, to reach out to Rick or myself so that we can potentially, help kind of facilitate bringing these types of therapies to those regions. I know that, Rick, it's been on your mind for a while.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just make sure that we acknowledge that on this show.
Yeah, thank you for that, Yasmin. Yeah, it's some of our most important work. I'm leaving tomorrow for Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and I'm speaking at a conference on mental health, integrative mental health in Abu Dhabi, and we're also trying to reach out to therapists from the Arab region who are interested in the learning about how MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD can be provided in their cultural context, and if people are interested in attending a training program that we're going to be offering at some point somewhere in the Arab region within 2024.
Amazing, amazing. And so I want to talk a little bit more about, who inspires you, Rick? Who are some of the greatest influences on your own journey in your own life?
Well, Stan Groff, I would say, is my main mentor in this area. He's 91, pretty amazing. And he is still, writing and talking and is, he's had a stroke, but I would say he's probably the primary person that has really helped legitimize this whole field and inspired me. I'm also, it's a while, he's no longer alive, but this theory of change that I have was reaffirmed back in 1983 by a man who was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. His name was Robert Mueller. And he wrote an incredible book, New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality. And the book had a cover of the Earth from Space on it. And he talked about how the UN has been created to help mediate conflicts between countries, but a lot of those conflicts are religious based. And we do need more tolerance for people from different religions. And his theory of change was that we needed to understand that deeper than our specific religions was this global spirituality. We're all part of this one, incredible experiment in the universe of life on Earth. And the book was terrific. Didn't say anything about psychedelics. And so I wrote him a letter and said, here's the Good Friday experiment. Here's other things. Would you help us bring back psychedelic research? And he wrote back, again, like Stan Groff, he wrote me back and he said he would help. And later he did. So Robert Mueller's book is one. And then there's another one that I'll share that is incredibly inspirational that most people have forgotten about it or never heard about it. But it's the meetings of the African Americans, Native Americans, and Europeans, their first meetings in North America in the 1520s and 30s. And it's a fellow named Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. And I would encourage, he was a conquistador. And this was after Cortez had conquered the Aztecs and was in Mexico City. And so Spain sent like 530 people on a new expedition to kind of link up with him and explore further areas north. And they got blown off course in a hurricane and they landed. They didn't know where. It turned out it was in the Tampa, Florida area, but they thought they were in Mexico. Over various misadventures, they all died except for 4 of them. One was an African American, and the other 3 were the Europeans. And they were kept as slaves. And they were asked to finally to do a healings. The people said, we've never seen people like you. You're the only survivors. You got to be of use to us. So we'd like you to do these healings. And these people are like, well, we're not healers. We're military people. And the Indians said, okay, we're just not going to feed you. And so then they tried this healings. And to their utter astonishment, it worked. We could say it's the placebo effect. Who knows what it is, but it worked. And they kept asking to be taken further west because these 4 people were trying to get connected back to Europeans, to Spaniards. It took them 8 years, but they had developed a great appreciation for the Native Americans. And they really had sort of conquered the country through their healings. All the Native Americans were willing to follow them, to do what they wanted. And then when they finally got to the West, where they saw signs of burned villages, destroyed crops, that's where they started seeing the slave raids from the Spaniards and what they were doing. And they actually acted on behalf of the Indians to negotiate with Cortez. And Cortez saw their connection to the Native Americans, and separated them, put them in chains, and shipped 3 of them back to Spain in chains. And the book that is existing is by Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, To the King. And so it's one of the most inspirational stories ever. Henry Miller, an author in America, wrote an introduction to it. And so it's about the real gold of cooperation, of love, of healing. While we look for the false gold or of just money, that's not going to do what we need. But this real gold of love, connection, common humanity. So the story of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca is a major inspiration for me.
Amazing. And what's the exact title of the book again?
Well, it's sort of Adventures in the Unknown America, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. And it's his report to the king about what happened during the expedition. And he later redeemed himself, just to say, and he was sent to lead an expedition to South America. He explored thousands of miles and did it without killing a single person that they encountered.
Wow.
Yeah. And there's The Power Within by Haniel Long is, I'd say, a good place for people to start. The Power is Within by Haniel Long. And he wrote what he called an interlinear, which is this idea that Cabeza de Vaca had to be careful because this was during the time of the Inquisition, and he had to be careful what he said to the king. So this poetic interlinear by Haniel Long is about what he would have written if he was free to write what he really felt. So it's a beautiful introduction to the story. And then I think people could read, if they were interested, the actual report to the king.
Amazing. Okay, cool. I've never heard of these books. So
yeah, it's like buried American history. It's the path not taken. It's what we need to know.
Wow. And, Rick, looking back on this journey, what has surprised you the most could be about humanity, it could be about psychedelics, the work from MAPS, what has surprised you the most?
I think what has surprised me the most is that we have managed to obtain bipartisan support. That was our goal the entire time, but I really wasn't sure that it was possible. But we have managed to really, in America that's extremely polarized, found a way to have the psychedelic healing be bipartisan support. I'd say that's the thing that has amazed me the most. And it's in part strategy, that we felt that if we can help veterans, then we would be able to have support from more Republicans and more, Christian fundamentalists and all that by the choice of who we were helping. Most people that have PTSD are women with sexual abuse. 2/3 of the people in our studies are women, but the media gives the most attention to the veterans. But I think it's been this both conscious strategy, but it's also been very surprising how well that it's actually been something that everybody could come together on, because we see, and I see this constantly, that people from all sides of the political spectrum, all sides of religion, everybody has family members or friends that are suffering, that they're not quite getting the support that they need from currently available medicines and treatments, and that then they need to, for hope, explore other alternatives. So, I'm just so grateful that is something that is the case in America, that we've taken psychedelic healing out of the culture wars and made it something that everybody can support.
Yes. Amen to that. So, and then what do you want to tell our listeners about their well-being, their wellness? Like, what's kind of your main takeaway or call to action that you want people to do, today?
Well, I'd like really for people to educate themselves. I think that that's something that doesn't really cost money. You can try to look at scientific papers about MDMA for PTSD, or you can look at various books or articles. But I think really people in general, and I described it for myself, that I bought the propaganda. So I think the most important thing now is for people just really to educate themselves about what is going on with psychedelic research, what is going on with the thousands of years of use. There's an incredible book called The Immortality Key
Yes.
by Brian Muir-Rescue that I think people might want to consider reading as part of education. It's about the Eleusinian mysteries that I talked about, but it's also about the several hundred years in the after Jesus Christ period during the formation of the Catholic Church, where these psychedelic rituals coexisted with the church until the church finally wiped them out. But it's about how the early wine, the claim is that the early wine used in the Catholic services was spiked with psychoactive psychedelic drugs. And I think it makes a really good case. But I think people really should educate themselves. And then people should think about what does this mean for them personally or for family or loved ones? And then go the next step, I think, which would be to really look at the drug war. And does that seem helpful or not? And is there some way for people to support the emergence of these treatments into practice? Because it's never really been about the science. It's been about the politics that has blocked the research. Now, because I mentioned the careful use of veterans and others, we have bipartisan support. So the politics is favorable now, but it's drug war has never been about the really helping people to block drug abuse. It's always been political as well. So I'd say educate yourself both about psychedelics, both historical and current research, but also about the drug war, and also I think about one thing that's really helpful for people it's called clinicaltrials.gov. So clinicaltrials.gov. And that's the list of all the psychedelic studies, of all the research actually that's going on. And you can just put in a drug and a condition and you can see what's going on in your area. So this gets back to your earlier question. If people want to volunteer for psychedelic research, this is a way to figure out what studies are taking place that you might qualify for. And it's also just a great way to educate yourself about what research is taking place.
Amazing, amazing. There's so many good things to follow up on. And I actually interviewed Brian from the Immortality Key. So folks can check out, that episode. Rick, this has been so lovely. I'm so grateful for your time and learned a lot from this conversation. Are there any resources that you can point folks to in order to learn more about you?
Yeah, I would say check out the MAPS website. So maps.org, we are looking for members. So if anybody wants to donate, that would be great. But if you look at my bio, there's a link to my dissertation from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard on the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics and marijuana. There's a link to the follow-up to the Concord Prison Experiment by Leary, to the Good Friday Experiment that I talked about. And also there's a link to my TED Talk and also another talk that I gave about my origin story. So I think if people just wanted to learn about me, they could go to the bio on the MAPS website, but also there's an enormous amount of information on the MAPS website as well for people to learn.
Amazing. And we'll include that in the show notes so that people can easily navigate to MAPS.
Okay, terrific.
Amazing, amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time, Rick. This has been so lovely. Learned so much from you, and this is a powerful conversation.
Thank you, Yasmin. Yeah, I think we're getting the data, but people need to hear the stories. And so I really appreciate what you're doing.
Oh, thank you. And for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about the journey of psychedelics and MAPS with Rick Doblin. You could tune into Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Thanks again. What would you like to see change in your life? And what is the biggest obstacle that you're facing now? I run a 5-week program at the Inner Knowing School for serious individuals who are ready to take the next step in their personal and professional lives. I will personally be coaching a small group of individuals, a number of practical tools and frameworks for creating an intuition practice and for self-mastery. You can find more at theinnerknowingschool.com. I have a master's certification in intuition medicine, and I've condensed 10 plus years of experience and research navigating how to harness your energy and intuition in an easy to access live curated course. Now, as someone who's helped countless creatives, entrepreneurs, and many who are just plain stuck, open doors of possibility they never thought existed, I've seen this strategy transform people's inner states and external reality. And the best part is that you'll skyrocket your output and unlock your creative genius. I'll work with you weekly live to overcome your limiting beliefs and show you how to manage your energy instead of your time. I'll teach you how to create clarity, processes, develop your intuition based on some of the top tools and frameworks that I've developed, and you'll get access to guided meditations and visualizations not available anywhere else. This method is so effective that even if you don't have that much time, or if you think that you might not be ready, this will work for you. You can check out the link in the show notes to join the waiting list, and you can check out what past clients had to say about the program. Wishing you all many blessings ahead.